Hi, Colonel. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Good. I'm not so good. I'm feeling quite anxious, actually, about the developments in the last 2 weeks. I can't make sense of them because they feel kind of nihilistic and self-destructive. But I do rely on you to sort me out on this stuff. So I guess I'll start off by asking you about the two kind of big newsworthy events, although there are many. Well, and then one just happened too, that OPEC said they were cutting back oil a few minutes ago. So I don't know what that means. But tell me, what is your sense of the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline? What is your view about what happened there?
Well, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of people have been asking me that question, and I have to tell everyone that at the moment, I do not have all the facts. And so the best I can do is speculate on the basis of who likely benefits from the damage to the pipeline versus who suffers. And when you look at the who benefits, that leads you to certain conclusions. And then you have to ask the question, who has the capability to do such a thing? And that narrows the field even more. So I would say if you ask who's got the capabilities, well, clearly in the area, the Royal Navy, the United States Navy, and their respective special operations forces, they definitely have the capability. The Poles, simply because of the proximity of their shipyards and facilities, could play a role in this, but it's unlikely they could have done it on their own. And the only other Navy in the world that springs to mind that could have done something is the Japanese Navy, but I doubt they were in the Baltic. So I think that's where we are. And the interesting news just received a few minutes ago is from a German source is that the Germans have concluded that the damage can actually be repaired, that it is not so serious that, the pipeline is permanently out of action. Now, whether or not that turns out to be true, I don't know.
Yeah.
But the German spokesman, and I presume he's in Berlin, but he could be somewhere else, made the comment that they were already talking to other partners about affecting repairs. So we'll see how that goes, if that turns out to be accurate or not.
You obviously know about this funny little tweet that came from, I believe he was a Polish member of the European government, saying thank you USA or something along those lines, and showing a photograph of the thing bubbling up in the ocean. I mean, I thought, what games are being played here? You know, on one hand, they're saying, America's saying we didn't do it. You've got Poland, who's kind of itching for a fight, thanking them. I mean, what did you make of that tweet?
Well, this was the former Polish foreign minister, Sikorski.
Yes.
He's married to Anne Applebaum, who is a very prominent neocon, an advocate for war with Russia and regime change in Moscow. So it's not surprising that he made that comment. Is it true? Again, I don't know. It could be. But again, he may also have concluded, based upon whatever his wife told him, that we had a role in this because we seem to have been interested in preventing Germany and other Central European states from benefiting from cheap Russian natural gas in order to ensure that Germany in particular stays on side against Russia, something that, frankly, the government in Berlin has never been comfortable with.
And so obviously, when you're looking at an event like this, as they do when police are investigating a crime, right, they say who benefits from it. So who benefits from this pipeline being out of service? Because it seems to me, if when people are saying Russia, they could just turn the gas off rather than blowing up their own pipeline, right? So,
of course, absolutely.
So who benefits from this?
Well, the assumption is that the United States wants to ensure that under no circumstances will the Germans cooperate with the Russians on anything. So one assumes that for that reason alone, whatever you can do to prevent Germany from receiving natural gas is part of it. Then we also have to note that within 24 hours of the pipeline damage, a pipeline from Norway to Poland began operating, pumping natural gas to Poland. Of course, natural gas from Norway is infinitely more expensive than the natural gas from Russia. And that's one of the reasons everybody wanted to use Russian natural gas, because it's very inexpensive.
Yeah.
And have to keep in mind that Germany really is the scientific industrial giant in Europe, and probably one of the top 4 in the world in terms of chemical industries, heavy industries, steel, manufacturing of all sorts of machine tools. Natural gas is a vital component of all of that. Then on top of that, you've got the agricultural dimension. Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, very productive agrarian sectors. And the fertilizers that come along with the natural gas from Russia are equally important. Right now, farmers cannot maintain the food that they've grown because they can't power the greenhouses and freezing facilities that they normally use. So the whole agricultural sector is crashing, and the defense scientific industrial sector is crashing, particularly in Germany, because they don't have the cheap natural gas to operate. So who benefits from that? Well, the Norwegians obviously seem to bear ill will for Germany and others. Mm-hmm. They're profiting from this, but they've already made it clear to the British and others that they don't have enough energy to share with Great Britain, that is headed into a very dangerous winter right now. So somebody is benefiting besides Norway. Presumably the United States thinks that it can sell liquefied natural gas. The problem is moving it. There are very few ships built to move liquefied natural gas. And at the moment, Germany does not have an LNG terminal to receive it. So I don't know how that's going to work out.
Is there thinking amongst the smart people like you that if America did do this, that part of the logic behind it would be to purposely escalate the tensions because they're interested in escalating the fight with, well, Ukraine, but in the end, Russia? Is it a provocation, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Trish, the problem with this is that technically, if the Russians decided to do so, they could regard this damage to their pipeline as an act of war.
Right.
And if they trace it back to the United States, then that would justify war with the United States. But Mr. Putin, at least as far as I can tell over the last 20 plus years, has done everything in his power to avoid that.
Yeah.
And of course, while Mr. Trump was in office, there was a lot of cooperation on the military side and intelligence side between Russia and the United States. Russians cooperated with us in Afghanistan. They cooperated with us in Syria on numerous occasions. They provided us with extremely valuable intelligence on the Islamist threat, terrorist networks, worked with us on that score. And Trump made it abundantly clear that he did not want to treat Russia as an enemy, which was very unpopular in Washington, not necessarily with the American people. I don't think most Americans really understand the complexity of this whole problem, but large numbers of Americans, if you ask them, would probably readily tell you that they have no interest in war with Russia. So the people who are most interested in war with Russia all seem to be concentrated in Washington, D.C., perhaps some in the financial markets in New York City. And obviously, since many of the people that are dominant in the financial markets also own the media and are also controlling much of Congress because of their campaign donations and so forth, have an interest in this sort of thing. But once you move out of those circles, there's really no appetite in the United States for war, any more than I suspect there is in Canada. And clearly, Mr. Trudeau in Canada has been vociferous in his attacks on the Russians, which I think are ridiculous, but that's my own opinion.
Well, and you know what's interesting for us watching this play out in our prime ministers, I mean, I just believe that he's an influenced globalist now, but, you know, back in the day, we were known for staying out of Vietnam and, you know, doing peacekeeping. We were known for staying out of Iraq. Because the Canadian public had no appetite for those conflicts, and the Canadian, you know, we always try to feel that we're somewhat more reluctant to get into these type of conflicts, but something's changed here, and I believe it is because of the globalist movement, right? That Trudeau's fealty is to that ideology rather than representing what Canadians actually feel. But I also feel in saying that some Canadians are sort of captured by this ideology too, and they've put the Ukraine flags up. And that means that we have to fight to the bitter end to rescue this country from the narrative that's being spun, right? I think it's really changed us.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, although I'm not surprised. To remember Harold Macmillan, who was, in my judgment, a very fine prime minister for Great Britain, one of the last good, really good prime ministers with an understanding of the world, made it abundantly clear to President Kennedy in private during the Cuban Missile Crisis that Britain, under no circumstances, would support an intervention in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And if the United States went in there, it would not go in with British support. And I recall very vividly at the time, in my own family, people made the observations that thank God for the British, they're a voice of reason. Well, that voice of reason is also silenced. And you have people now in London, in Washington, in Ottawa, who are all committed to this globalist cause. Now, I think you have to look at the World Economic Forum. You have to look at who's a member.
Yeah.
Then you have to look at money flows. And we have our own set of oligarchs in the West, like Mr. Soros, who have actively funded the globalist movement, which involves open borders, green energy, the effective destruction of our scientific industrial capacity, and so forth, the denationalization of states.
Yeah.
So all of this is bound up with the war against Putin, because he's led the fight against denationalization, against U.S. dollar-dominated operations and global finance that is aimed at essentially controlling his country. He's made that abundantly clear. He's now has on side with him and support, obviously, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, large number, most people, frankly, in Southeast Asia. The Japanese really are unhappy with what's going on because this whole process is destroying their economy. They want nothing to do with it, and they have a very precarious debt to GDP ratio as we do. So I think the world in general is not supportive of this. This little globalist club is limited to North America and Western Europe largely, and there are other unwilling participants inside the European Union and NATO, which is why back in January, when I was first asked about whether or not the Russians would go in, and I said they would, and they said, what's the outcome? I said, I don't think NATO will survive this, because interests are different everywhere. You know, George Washington was approached by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson thought that we should join the French Revolution and support them. He said, after all, the French supported us. And his comment was, well, no, the King of France supported us. Yeah. Not the French Revolution. And he said, no, but we need to be part of this global revolution. And he said, we can't do it. And he said, no country can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests. Well, I think we and you and Britain and many other states in Europe have already moved beyond our own interests.
Absolutely.
We had no interest in determining who would control Eastern Ukraine. We had no interest in this conflict at all. We have no interest in destroying Russia's economy or anyone else's economy. The one interest we had, as President Trump pointed out, was in bringing this to a very rapid close. And the thing that I expected, and everybody that had, in my judgment, any understanding of world events expected, was that Biden and his administration would behave like every Washington administration had since Eisenhower, and that is to move quickly to put an end to conflict that involved Russia and Europe.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons I'm feeling anxiety, and certainly many people I know are feeling a lot of anxiety about the nukes angle of this, including somebody who said to me on the phone the other day, do I need a go bag? Like, do I need to race to the country at some point? Is that what's happening now? Which seems like hyperbole, but actually it's not, right? I mean, here's what's troubling for me, amongst many troubling things, is that people like, maybe they're friends of yours, but General Keane and David Petraeus, in interviews on legacy media, are normalizing now in conversation the use of use of limited nukes. And I just kind of feel like I've been transported to another planet in listening to these people talk that way. Is that why are they doing that?
Well, you have to, in the case of Petraeus and Keane, and by the way, neither of these men are friends of mine. I mean, I know them and they know me, and we are 180 degrees apart from each other in terms of our views.
Yeah.
But you have to understand who is paying them. And when I say paying them, it's not as though you're on a standard payroll, but look at the financial firms that they joined after leaving the military in New York City. Look at the people the candidates that those firms support. Those candidates are people like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joseph Biden, and so forth. They also are now multimillionaires as a result of being rewarded for their support and involvement in the execution of these interventions, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also in Libya and elsewhere. So they're part of a larger group that I was trying to explain earlier when I talked about Washington, New York, and the media. They're part of that complex, and they're actively saying these things. Now, the notion of a limited nuclear war is absurd. Anyone with any sense at all has understood that now for 70 years. It's an impossibility. There's no such animal. The notion that there is a tactical nuclear weapon is equally misleading. As a friend of mine says, "Oh, Doug, we'll just use a tactical nuclear weapon and that'll signal our position." And I said, well, if you're sitting in Moscow or Beijing or any number of places and suddenly a low yield nuclear weapon, which means 5 kilotons or less, explodes in the country next to you, in this case, Ukraine, and kills several thousand of your troops and destroys a lot of infrastructure, no one is going to say, oh, well, let's not get too excited. That was a small nuclear detonation. Yeah. In fact, what they'll do is say, look, we better use our arsenal and launch a first strike before we lose it. And everyone has always known that. So, first of all, there is no evidence that Vladimir Putin has any interest whatsoever in using nuclear weapons. Quite the contrary. He's made it very clear on numerous occasions that weapon is purely a retaliatory weapon in the event that his country is directly attacked by another state and that state uses nuclear weapon. Otherwise, it's off the table. Secondly, no one in their right mind is going to use a nuclear weapon on their doorstep. And the Israelis, for instance, are armed with nuclear weapons. Would they use a nuclear weapon on the Golan Heights? Absolutely not. Would they use it immediately next door on the ground in Syria or Jordan? Out of the question. I mean, that's just lunacy. We would not use a nuclear weapon on the border between Mexico and Texas. Absurd. So this is all nonsense. And I think it's designed to scare the American people in the hope that the American people will be more supportive of what's happening in Ukraine. I don't think it works. I think it's counterproductive, and I think it's dangerous.
Yeah. So let's talk, given how corrupt, I guess is the best way to put it, legacy media is in the way they cover the story. We know we can't trust them. What is happening actually, in your view, on the ground? Because we're hearing that they're losing places, they're winning places. We're hearing that the voting in Donbass was not legit. I mean, where do we actually stand now?
Well, I think you have to go to alternative media sources, and you have to listen to various accounts to reach any sort of reasonable conclusion. First of all, I really think that these referenda that were conducted were legitimate. People forget the area where the Russian forces are currently sitting were, in fact, already Russian. And one of the problems they had when they first went in, when the Russian army did, right now the Russian army is largely elsewhere. It is not in southern Ukraine. These are militia forces, the Chechen forces, the Wagner mercenary groups, volunteer organizations from the Kuban Cossacks and other places. Very good fighters, by the way. Much, much better than what we would call the National Guard. But they are running an economy of force operation in southern Ukraine. They are essentially placeholders because the regular army was pulled back to refit, reorganize, re-equip. I thought they might attack in force in August, but for various reasons that was delayed. And I don't think you're going to see a major Russian offensive to terminate this conflict until really November, when the ground freezes, because that's a precondition for Russian maneuver forces. Second, I think people need to understand that when they say, well, there's an offensive. Okay, there's an offensive. And what do you have? You have usually on the scale of 30 or 40,000 Ukrainian troops committed against perhaps 4,000 of these Russians. And the Russians, of course, are backed up by large numbers of regular army artillery and rocket fire and missiles and air force. And what they have been told is, you do not have to request permission if you deem it wise to withdraw to a more defensible position. You make those decisions on your own. The only thing that you're being asked to do right now is inflict as much damage as possible on the attacking Ukrainians, which they're doing, and defend the territory to the best of your ability. So when they say, well, we've had great success in this offensive, you're usually talking about an advance of perhaps 20 kilometers across fairly open, rolling terrain, and the withdrawal of Russian forces to a subsequent defensive position, which gives them better fields of fire and allows them to inflict more damage on the Ukrainians. Ukrainians have probably taken 100,000 dead. There may be 200,000 or 300,000 or more wounded. Again, we have to speculate. We don't have data, and anything that comes out of Kiev has to be dismissed out of hand as untrue.
Yeah.
And the Russians don't really know in great detail how many they've killed or wounded. They just know that the losses taken by the Ukrainians are enormous. And they're down to very few armored fighting vehicles. In fact, they just received 250 T-72s from two former Warsaw Pact countries. And that's probably all that they have for a tank force that's left. And how they're going to use that is anybody's guess. There was a claim made last night that 50,000 Ukrainian troops are part of a larger offensive that were all trained in England by the British Army. What we're hearing now is that number is probably no greater than 30,000. It may be much less. And that means that they're probably the only ones out of a force of, say, 100,000 who have very much formal training.
Yeah.
So the situation in Kiev is very desperate. And then the final point is that Mr. Zelensky has been saying a lot of things that reflect this desperation. He let it slip to the Ukrainian media that he had directed a group of scientists and engineers to work on building a quote unquote dirty nuclear bomb. Well, they were going to use spent uranium fuel from one of the nuclear power plants because they don't have weapons grade uranium. That is, they don't have plutonium. But with spent uranium fuel, you could certainly do damage, but it takes time to build that, and then you've got to deliver it. Those are not easy tasks, but he's let these kinds of things slip. I think it's a measure of just how very desperate he is. Everybody keeps talking about Putin being desperate. I can't find any evidence for it. Just as they say, well, 100,000 Russian men have left the country to avoid being drafted. Well, first of all, there is no draft. They just brought, per se, about 134,000 were already admitted to the Russian army this year. That's a draft segment that happens annually. But most of the troops are professional. And in this case, these are 300,000 reservists who are being used largely to relieve Russian forces in other parts of Russia so that they could be concentrated in the West and in Belarusia. So I think Mr. Putin is actually in pretty good shape. Their economy is doing very well.
Yeah.
There is no food shortage. There is no shortage of fuel, and there's no lack of ammunition or armored fighting vehicles or anything else. So I think it's Mr. Zelensky who's quite desperate, and this is almost his last gasp right now with these counteroffensives that are bleeding the Ukrainians badly and are not really gaining anything strategically for Ukraine.
Well, I don't know if you saw it. I'm sure you did. There's a video of him signing this NATO document, to get entry into NATO. He's got these two kind of thuggish looking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they look like wrestlers or something beside, and they're all wearing camo green. And so it was just ridiculous. Like he does the big flourish. It's like, how more kind of provocative can he be? Like, wait, I didn't understand what that was in service of, except to kind of keep the information flow in his favor as this, Churchillian kind of character who's fighting off the forces of evil. It just seemed unnecessary.
Well,
dangerous.
I don't recall Sir Winston Churchill posing for a photo opportunity with thuggish-looking British soldiers.
Yeah. I mean, it's
somebody was talking to me about Biden, who spoke in Philadelphia in this very weird setting with red lights and these two Marines in the shadows. And I said to somebody, well, I'm not a Democrat, and I wasn't alive when FDR was there. Don't necessarily think he was great for the country, but FDR had fireside chats. Hardly the Biden approach.
Yeah.
So there's something very bewildering about all of this.
It is bewildering. I don't understand it. None of it makes sense to me. And I've been doing this for 40 years. And I guess that's what my anxiety is about too, because I have a very devoted audience of people who love to come to the show and hear some good old-fashioned critical thinking. Some of them are mad at me because I'm not buying into the legacy media line on Ukraine, even though I was around for weapons of mass destruction. I was working as a journalist then, I remember how everybody gets things wrong. And yet it's kind of like Lucy and Charlie Brown in the football. Charlie always thinks she's not going to pull it away, and she always does. And that's been my experience with legacy media and covering, issues of war. I want to ask you a couple of things specifically about where we are. So we have this escalating rhetoric between the three sides, if you want to look at it that way: Russia, Ukraine, and then, of course, Washington. Are there people in the European Union, in NATO, who are doing back channel discussions with the Biden administration saying, we don't want this, tone it down? Would that be happening as far as you know?
I'm sure there are exchanges like that because they always happen. When I was on active duty, the people that were most supportive of the Kosovo air campaign were people like the Norwegians or the English, who were remote from the scene of action.
Right.
The Italians, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, Romanians, the Hungarians, everybody else was very uncomfortable with what was going on because they understood how fragile the conditions in the Balkans were and how this could lead to a wider war that might even include Russia.
Yeah.
We managed to keep them on side, and we ultimately negotiated a deal with Moscow, in which we promised Moscow, which at the time was governed by Mr. Yeltsin, all sorts of things that I can't go into, that most of which I doubt were ever delivered, in return for their informing Milosevic that they could not guarantee support for him through the coming winter. That was the reason that Milosevic threw in the towel, because what he was most concerned about was food and fuel for the Balkan winter. When it became clear he wasn't going to get that, he said, I've got to cut our losses and pull out. So these kinds of things do happen. And historically, we've paid a lot more attention to what our major allies thought than we do today. I think there has been a tendency to treat the European states not quite as vassal states, but certainly as military dependencies who are expected to show up and do what they were told. And I think that's going to end as a result of this, which should end, particularly in Germany. Will
NATO survive it, do you think?
I think it's going to be tough. Imagine you are a German citizen, and I've got emails from friends in Germany, and they're telling me that now wood has become gold in Germany. Ugh. And Germans are going into the forest to chop down trees and get wood to heat themselves. You've got to understand something. I lived in Germany for almost off and on for 8 years of my life. I went there as an exchange student in 1969. I first visited there in 68. And I can tell you that the Germans probably, this is long before anybody thought about ecology or the green movement, really worship trees. If you're trying to move a tree, they keep their forests, or used to, the way you would keep your garden. Yeah. The forests were immaculate. The farmers and country people went in there twice a year to clean out everything, so you never had forest fires. They were acutely sensitive to watersheds, and no one would remove a tree without permission, practically from Berlin. So for the Germans to be doing that, things are bad. I know they can't get cooking oil. I know that the shelves in many stores and shops are empty. People are genuinely worried about food shortages. And as one German pointed out, who's dead now to me many years ago, all through World War II until the very end of the war, everybody inside the greater German empire ate. No one starved. And that was because of the experience with the British blockade during World War I. So now you're dealing with a government that is a parliamentary democracy, that is part of an alliance of states that we regard as Western liberal political systems. And suddenly the Germans are facing the high probability of thousands of people dying for lack of heat, the lack of food, the lack of medicines, the lack of all sorts of things that they had taken for granted. Now, would you stay in an alliance led by the United States that produced that outcome in your country?
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking. So I know you got to go. So let's wrap up with a couple of questions. I want to talk to you about why no negotiations, but I also want to hear your kind of your intel and your theory about what then the agenda of the United States and the State Department and Blinken and Sullivan and Tory and Newland and all those people really is now. Do they want a war? Do they actually want a real hot war with Russia? Is that what they want?
Well, I don't think they do. I don't think, however, that there was ever any coherent strategy. We are governed at the moment by ideologues. These are not people that approach international relations on the basis of understood interests. You know, you'll regard or refer to the European past. The question was, what is Paris's interest? What is the interest that Vienna has? What is the interest that Moscow has? There is no interest in interests. This is an ideological war waged by the globalists who are neocons and other things, committed to the ruin and destruction of a government and a state that stands in their minds in the way of their globalist revolution and conquest. That's all. And so whenever you would ask the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, or anybody, what is your goal? Our goal is to harm Russia.
Yeah.
And then say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, make sure they can never do this again. Well, wait a minute. They're reacting to something that we did. Well, if we don't do this, they'll try to reconquer Eastern Europe. Well, you just said that the Russian forces are small. They're hardly the danger that you originally thought they were. So how can they threaten Eastern Europe when they seem to be struggling according to you, against Ukraine? You understand? These are the contradictions that people are thinking and hearing, but you never hear that from a journalist in the West. Those things never come up. But anybody with a brain asks those questions. So first, there is no strategy. We have a group of ideologues, and they don't regard any interest that may be articulated in Moscow as legitimate. For that matter, they don't give a damn what anybody in Berlin, London, or anywhere else thinks. They expect everyone to get in line and help destroy this holdout against their programs of denationalization, financial domination, globalism, and so forth.
It always shocks me how easy it is if you demonize an opponent the way that they do in the legacy media in the States. And I obviously, the neocons know this, how people will fall in line. I was looking for more information. I try to read whatever is written. I found this guy named Timothy Snyder at Yale, who's got a new piece in Foreign Affairs. My hair is on fire. It was so bizarre. And he's like a big deal, right?
Well, these are the people that dominate academia in the United States and in most of the West. They preach doctrines that are based, I think, on a very false narrative about the past. I was trying to explain to someone, I'm sure there are many of your listeners that are in a similar position. My maternal grandfather fought in the First World War, and he and his entire class from the University of Pennsylvania enlisted and went to fight, and he went in as a private, came back as a first lieutenant in 1920. But, he pointed out we lost 318,000 we had 318,000 casualties. He said we had 110,000 dead. The United States Army and armed forces on the ground in France only fought for 110 days. He said, Douglas, that's 1,000 dead Americans in every battle. Oh. And he said, when it was over, we were trying to understand what it was that we fought for. And he said, as we looked around, we saw a lot of evidence that we were rescuing the French from certain defeat, and the British weren't far behind, and they were all imperialists, and we Americans were not. And the best people I met and talked to on the battlefield were Germans. And he said, we all came back from this and said, what were we doing over there killing Germans? What was the point? What were we trying to achieve? Where was this great democratic revolution? Where was the war to end all wars? It's all nonsense. And so years later, in the 1960s, when I was a teenager, there would be fights in the family about what was happening in Vietnam. And my mother would say, but Daddy, we have to support the troops. And he would become angry. And he said, if you support the troops, get them out of Vietnam.
Yeah.
I never forgot that.
Your dad is what a wise guy. I mean, it's like love the troops, hate the war or something like that.
Well, he was my grandfather, but I never forgot that.
Yeah.
And that's why when I looked at these things, certainly since 2003, when I was asked to come in and plan the advance on Baghdad, everyone told me, we're not going to stay. We're going to go in there. We're going to install a new government. We're going to pull out. And I thought, well, that's reasonable because everybody who's ever stayed has regretted it. It's a waste of time.
Yeah.
But, none of it happened. Everything was a lie. And I think Americans are beginning to get this. I really do. But it's a long, hard slog because people are too ready to believe whatever comes through the television or the radio without first saying, well, wait a minute, who's telling me this? And who do they work for? And why are they saying it? And that's what you have to ask with people like Petraeus and Keene and others.
Well, I think the most dangerous thing, well, there are many dangerous things, but one of the dangerous things right now is that the left, which under normal circumstances is kind of out there asking, or was out there asking hard questions, is now so devoted to the Democratic Party that they're kind of blindly supporting this. So there are all these really strange political alignments right now that make me very nervous. But let me ask my last question, because I know you got to run. Give me a quick answer on all the stuff, the money, the weapon systems, everything that's being sent to Ukraine. What's actually happening with it in your view? Where's it going?
Well, somebody told me recently that the total amount of alleged aid is $69 billion.
Wow.
But the vast majority of the cash never leaves the United States. The cash is simply moved from the Hill after the Treasury prints it at the direction of the Congress.
Yeah.
And then that cash goes to the Pentagon to pay for the equipment that is taken out of war stocks and shipped to Ukraine. Then that same bundle of cash is transferred to the defense industries, who are being asked to replenish the stocks that were just depleted through shipment to Ukraine. So it's kind of a shell game.
Wow.
Now, that doesn't mean that we haven't shipped money over there, because we know we're effectively paying for the Ukrainian government, its bureaucracy, its military, its soldiers, its leadership. All of that is American cash. But that's minuscule compared with the billions for the weapon systems and the ammunition. Now, once it gets into the country, I'm told that, you're lucky to see 40% or 50% of that equipment ultimately reach the front because of the widespread corruption inside Ukraine, which is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It's the leader in Europe and one of the leaders in the world in terms of human trafficking, especially involving women and children. And it leads in pornography and a whole number of different areas. This is hardly the pristine liberal democracy that's being portrayed. But the worst part is that the Ukrainian people are being exploited by us in a proxy war. And I think proxy wars are fundamentally immoral. If you're not willing to fight the war yourself, what gives you the right morally to expect someone else to die in your cause?
Well, that's the big moral question surrounding this whole event for me, and I'm so glad you posed it, albeit rhetorically. I hope people are listening to the question, because I don't understand why it's okay to keep pushing and escalating when lots of innocent people are dying, and the outcome is very likely going to be not what they want it to be, correct?
Oh, the Russians are going to be the big winners in this contest, unfortunately. And everything that we have known for 50, 60, 70 years is going to change as a result of this reckless policy.
Oh, goodness. Okay, Colonel Macgregor, I'm so glad to have you on. I really appreciate your straight talking. I know you got to run, but thanks for making some time for us today. Have a good day.
Thank you. God bless.
Thanks, Colonel. Bye.